Imagine being 12 years old and finally given the chance to stay home alone for the first time. It's a milestone you've been dreaming of, a small taste of independence. But what should have been a simple, quiet evening quickly spirals into a nightmarish descent into terror that will haunt you forever. As you curl up on the couch with your favorite comic book, the comforting hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock are the only sounds breaking the eerie silence of the house. But then, a strange noise pierces through the calm, a rhythmic thumping, growing louder and more unsettling with each passing moment. Curiosity leads you to investigate, only to discover something beyond comprehension. Your beloved cat, Midnight, lies in a pool of blood, mangled and unrecognizable. The nightmare escalates as you approach the broken window, where a grotesque, inhuman face stares back at you with a chilling grin and hollow eyes. Before you can even react, skeletal fingers reach through the shards of glass, pulling you into an abyss of darkness and fear. As you struggle to escape, you realize the true horror has only just begun. The darkness is relentless, and the terror lurking in the shadows is far from over. Stay with me as I unravel the chilling events of that fateful night, where reality and nightmare collide in a horrifying journey that will leave you questioning the very essence of safety and sanity. Brace yourself for a story where every shadow hides a secret, and every creak of the house could be the prelude to unimaginable horror. Will you be able to handle the truth? Keep watching to find out. Let's start our story, but first make sure you are subscribed to the channel. It is very important so that YouTube can deliver our content to more people. See you at the end of the video. I could hardly believe it, tonight was the night. For the first time ever, my parents actually trusted me to stay home alone. I'd been begging for this for what felt like forever, and now, here I was, curled up on the living room couch with my favorite comic book, the whole house to myself. The silence was comforting, almost soothing. I could hear the faint tick-tock of the old clock on the wall and the soft hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. It was just me, my comic book, and the quiet. I felt a small swell of pride, knowing that my parents believed I was responsible enough to handle this. It felt like a milestone, a sign that I was growing up. I let out a contented sigh, sinking deeper into the couch cushions. The scent of Mom's lavender air freshener lingered in the air, making everything feel familiar, safe. I wasn't scared or nervous at all. If anything, I felt free. The kind of freedom that only comes when you realize you're finally being treated like an adult, even if just for a few hours. Every now and then, the floorboards creaked under the weight of the house settling, but that didn't bother me. I was used to those noises. The house was old, and it always made sounds like that. I'd learned to tune them out, just like I was doing now. I was so lost in my comic book that I almost didn't notice the first sound. It was soft at first, barely there, a rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere deeper in the house. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, or maybe the house making another one of its usual noises. I didn't pay it much mind. Midnight, our lazy old cat, was probably wandering around somewhere, and that's all it was. But the sound grew louder, more persistent. It wasn't just the creaking of the house. There was something off about it. I glanced up from my comic book, frowning. Midnight never made that much noise. Midnight? I called out, but there was no reply. The thumping continued, now joined by a strange scraping sound. My heart skipped a beat. I set my comic book down, suddenly feeling the weight of the stillness around me. The calm that had felt so comforting just a moment ago now seemed ominous, like the house was holding its breath, waiting. I stood up, my bare feet meeting the cold hardwood floor, and listened carefully. The sound was coming from my parents' room. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Everything in me was screaming to turn around, to just go back to the couch and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something pushed me forward. Curiosity? Or maybe something darker? I couldn't tell. With a deep breath, I slowly turned the knob and opened the door, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The room was dim, the only light coming from the half-moon outside, casting strange, eerie shadows across the floor. Everything looked normal at first, until I noticed the shattered window and the cold air blowing in, rustling the curtains. And then I saw the floor. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes locked onto the dark, matted fur lying in a pool of blood near the window. Midnight. But it wasn't midnight anymore. It was something else. Something twisted, broken, unrecognizable. The pride, the confidence I'd felt just minutes ago, evaporated, leaving only a cold, creeping fear that I couldn't shake. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. How could this have happened? What could have done this? I stumbled back, my foot catching on something soft. When I looked down, I saw another clump of fur, this one soaked in blood. Panic began to set in, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I had to call my parents, do something, anything, but all I could do was stand there, frozen in horror, staring at the nightmare that was unfolding in front of me. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard it felt like it might burst through my ribs. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer and darker with each passing second. I couldn't take my eyes off the mangled remains of midnight, my mind struggling to process the scene in front of me. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood, mingling with the faint trace of lavender air freshener that had once felt so comforting but now seemed out of place, almost mocking. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of that room as fast as I could, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the horror had rooted me to the spot, my legs refusing to obey the desperate commands of my brain. I tried to swallow, but my throat was dry, and the only sound that came out was a choked, strangled gasp. Then, out of the oppressive silence, I heard it, a low, menacing growl. The sound was so faint at first that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But as it grew louder, more distinct, I realized with a sinking dread that it was real. The growl wasn't like anything I'd ever heard from midnight. It was deep, guttural, filled with a kind of primal rage that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned slowly, my eyes darting around the room, searching for the source of the sound. The shadow seemed to shift and writhe, playing tricks on my mind, making it hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. I half expected something to leap out at me from the darkness, but the growl didn't come from anywhere in the room. It was somewhere else. Somewhere close, but not in sight. Midnight? I whispered again, my voice trembling. But there was no response, just the eerie silence pressing down on me. The growl had stopped, replaced by an even more unsettling sound, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like nails dragging across wood. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. The sound wasn't loud, but it was persistent, a steady, maddening rhythm that seemed to echo in my ears, growing more insistent with each passing second. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, but I had a sickening feeling it was getting closer. My gaze drifted to the shattered window. The cold night air blew in through the broken glass, making the curtains billow and flutter like ghostly figures. For a moment, I was mesmerized by the way they danced in the moonlight, their movements slow and deliberate, almost as if they were alive. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, just beyond the jagged edges of the broken window, was a face. At first, it was nothing more than a pale blur, half hidden in the shadows. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the details began to emerge, each one more horrifying than the last. The skin was a sickly, unnatural shade of gray, stretched tight over sharp, angular features that seemed almost inhuman. The cheekbones jutted out like jagged rocks, and the lips were pulled back in a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. But it was the eyes, or rather, the lack of them, that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. Where there should have been eyes, there were only deep, hollow pits, dark and empty, like windows into an endless void. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my throat had seized up in fear. The face just stared at me, unblinking, as if it was waiting, watching, enjoying my terror. Then, as if in slow motion, the creature moved. Its hand, or what I thought was a hand, emerged from the darkness, long and skeletal, with fingers that were unnaturally long and thin, almost like claws. The fingers scraped against the broken glass, producing that same eerie sound that had haunted me moments before. Each scrape was like a knife against my nerves, cutting deeper and deeper into my fear. The thing outside the window didn't just watch me, it studied me, like a predator sizing up its prey. And then, in one swift, horrifying movement, it lunged forward, shattering the remaining shards of glass with a deafening crash. Before I could react, those cold, bony fingers wrapped around my wrist with a grip that felt like iron. The touch was freezing, sending a jolt of icy pain shooting up my arm. I tried to yank my hand away, but the creature's grip only tightened, pulling me closer to the broken window. The world around me seemed to tilt, the room spinning as I was dragged forward. I could feel the sharp edges of the glass digging into my skin, cutting deep, but the pain was nothing compared to the overwhelming terror that gripped me. The face outside the window twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile, the corners of its mouth stretching impossibly wide as it pulled me closer and closer to the darkness beyond. Everything happened so fast, yet it felt like an eternity. I tried to scream, to shout for help, but no sound came out. My voice was trapped in my throat, suffocated by the sheer horror of what was happening. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, unable to process the nightmare that was unfolding before me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was that hideous, grinning face, its hollow eyes boring into mine, promising a fate worse than anything I could have imagined. And then, with one final, sickening yank, I was pulled through the window and into the night, the darkness swallowing me whole. The world outside the window was nothing like the familiar backyard I knew. There was no old oak tree swaying gently in the breeze, no comforting glow from the neighbor's porch light. Instead, I was plunged into an abyss of darkness, an unnatural void that seemed to swallow everything whole. The air was thick and cold, pressing against my skin like a suffocating blanket, and the silence was absolute, as if all sound had been drained from the world. I tried to get my bearings, but the moment my feet hit the ground, I stumbled. The earth beneath me was soft and uneven, more like the floor of a nightmare than the solid ground of reality. It felt spongy, almost alive, as if it was shifting beneath my weight. I looked around frantically, but there was nothing, just an endless, black void stretching out in every direction. The grip on my wrist was still there, cold and unrelenting, dragging me further into the darkness. Panic surged through me as I fought to break free, my fingers clawing at the skeletal hand that held me. But the more I struggled, the tighter it held on, pulling me deeper into the unknown. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, a frantic, desperate rhythm that matched the wild terror racing through my veins. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, each one more labored than the last. I was losing control, losing myself to the overwhelming fear that threatened to consume me. But then, in the midst of that all-encompassing darkness, I saw something. A flicker of movement, just on the edge of my vision. It was faint, barely more than a shadow, but it was there. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to see, hoping, praying, that it was something familiar, something that would make this nightmare end. The figure moved closer, and as it did, I felt a wave of cold wash over me. It wasn't the biting chill of a winter's night, but something far more sinister, more unnatural. The temperature dropped rapidly, turning the air icy, making my breath come out in visible puffs of steam. The darkness seemed to ripple and twist as the figure approached, its form becoming clearer with each passing second. I wanted to look away, to close my eyes and pretend this wasn't happening, but I couldn't. My gaze was locked onto the figure as it emerged from the shadows, taking shape before me. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, gangly limbs that seemed to stretch out into the void. The creature's skin was the same sickly, pale gray as the face I had seen through the window, but now it was stretched over a skeletal frame that was almost too thin, too fragile-looking to support itself. Its face, oh God, that face, was the same grotesque visage that had haunted me only moments before. The hollow eye sockets, the impossibly wide grin, the sharp, needle-like teeth that seemed to glisten in the darkness. It was like something out of a nightmare, a twisted parody of humanity that made my stomach churn with revulsion. But the worst part wasn't the face, or the way it moved with an unnatural, jerky grace. No, the worst part was the sound. As the creature drew closer, it began to whisper, soft, hissing words that I couldn't quite understand. The sound was like nails on a chalkboard, grating against my mind, filling me with a dread so intense it made my knees buckle. I wanted to cover my ears, to drown out the horrible sound, but the creature's grip on my wrist was unyielding. It kept pulling me forward, closer to that hideous face, closer to the source of the whispers. I could feel the icy breath of the creature on my skin, could see the glint of those sharp teeth as it leaned in closer, its mouth opening wider and wider as if it were about to swallow me whole. No! The word tore from my throat in a ragged, desperate cry. I twisted and fought with every ounce of strength I had left, my mind a blur of terror and adrenaline. I kicked and thrashed, trying to pull away, but the creature was too strong. It was like fighting against the pull of a riptide, every effort only dragging me further into the abyss. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, wrapping around my thoughts like a suffocating fog. I could barely think, barely hold on to the last threads of my sanity as the darkness closed in around me. But then, just as I was about to give in, to let the fear swallow me whole, something happened. A light. Faint at first, but growing brighter by the second. It pierced through the darkness, cutting through the shadows like a knife. The creature recoiled, its grip loosening just enough for me to wrench my wrist free. I stumbled backward, the light giving me just enough clarity to see that it wasn't coming from some external source, it was coming from within me. It was like a spark, a small, glowing ember that had been ignited deep in my chest. The more I focused on it, the brighter it became, pushing back the darkness, the whispers, the terror that had threatened to consume me. I didn't know where the light had come from, or what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going to let this creature take me. Not without a fight. With a surge of defiance, I turned to face the creature, the light now blazing brightly in my chest. The creature hissed, its grotesque face twisting in rage as the light drove it back. I could see it struggling to maintain its hold on me, its skeletal limbs twitching and convulsing as if the light was burning it from the inside out. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the spongy ground, the light guiding my way through the darkness. I could still hear the creature behind me, its horrible whispers now a shriek of fury, but the light kept it at bay, kept it from dragging me back into the abyss. I didn't know where I was running to, or if I would ever escape this nightmare, but I knew I had to keep going. I had to keep the light alive, had to keep moving forward, no matter what. Because if I stopped, if I let the darkness catch up to me, I knew I would be lost forever. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, each breath ragged and burning in my throat. The light within me flared with every step, pushing back the encroaching darkness, but I knew it wouldn't last forever. My legs were trembling, every muscle screaming in protest, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't let that thing catch me. The ground beneath me shifted and swayed, making every step treacherous. It felt like I was running on a living thing, something that pulsed and writhed just beneath the surface. I stumbled more than once, nearly falling, but each time I managed to regain my footing, driven by sheer terror. Behind me, I could still hear the creature, its shrieks cutting through the thick, suffocating air. They were closer now, the sound growing louder and more frantic as if it was enraged by the light that I clung to. I forced myself to keep going, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do. I couldn't run forever, not in this place. But where could I go? There was no sign of the world I knew, no familiar landmarks, no doorways to safety. Just the endless, pulsating darkness. I glanced over my shoulder, the light flickering as my concentration wavered. The creature was still there, its grotesque form lurching after me, driven by an unnatural hunger. Its limbs moved in a twisted, jerky rhythm, like a puppet on strings, and its eyes, those hollow, empty pits, were locked onto me with a hatred that seemed to burn hotter than the sun. But then, through the panic and fear, I noticed something. The light I was emitting wasn't just pushing back the darkness, it was revealing things, shapes in the void that hadn't been visible before. Shadows of objects, or maybe even doorways, that flickered into existence for just a moment before fading back into the blackness. I focused on the light, willing it to grow brighter, to show me the way out of this nightmare. And then, there it was, a faint outline in the distance, a structure of some kind, illuminated by the faint glow of my light. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a door, standing alone in the middle of the void. It didn't make any sense, but then, nothing about this place did. All I knew was that I had to reach it. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain in my legs and the burning in my chest. The door was my only hope, the only way out of this hellish nightmare. The creature behind me screeched, sensing that I was getting away, and I could feel its presence bearing down on me, closer and closer with every step. The door was just ahead now, a simple wooden door with a brass handle, standing alone in the darkness. It looked so out of place, so ordinary, but in that moment it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I reached out for the handle, my fingers trembling as I grabbed hold of it, and yanked the door open. Blinding light flooded through the doorway, so bright it hurt my eyes. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself through the door, desperate to escape, and as I did, I felt the creature's fingers brush against my ankle, cold and clammy, like death itself. But it was too late for it to stop me. The light swallowed me whole, pulling me away from the darkness, away from the creature, and then, everything went white. For a moment, I thought I was dead. The light was so intense, so overwhelming, that I couldn't see, couldn't think, couldn't feel anything but its warmth. It was like floating in a sea of pure, radiant energy, my body weightless, my mind at peace. But then, slowly, the light began to fade. Colors returned, soft and muted at first, then sharper, clearer. I realized I was lying on something solid, something familiar. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes, and when I finally did, I saw that I was back in my living room, sprawled out on the couch where this nightmare had begun. The room was exactly as I had left it, the clock ticking softly on the wall, the comic book lying on the cushion beside me, the faint scent of lavender lingering in the air. It was like nothing had happened, like I had just fallen asleep and dreamed the whole thing. But it wasn't a dream. I knew that. The terror I felt, the creature, the darkness, it was all real. Too real. I sat up, my body trembling, and looked around the room, half expecting to see the creature lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing there. No sign of the nightmare I had just escaped from. My wrist still ached from where the creature had grabbed me, and when I looked down, I saw faint bruises forming in the shape of long, bony fingers. I was back. I had made it out. But as I sat there, heart still racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. That somehow, some way, the darkness was still out there, waiting for me. I thought I was safe, but the haunting memory of that night clung to me like a shroud. The living room was quiet, almost too quiet, and every creak of the house seemed amplified in the silence. I tried to convince myself that it was all over, that I was back in the safety of my own home. But deep down, I knew that escaping wasn't as simple as walking through a door. The light that had saved me was gone, and the darkness had settled back into every corner of the room. I stared at the spot where the creature had tried to pull me through the window, the shattered glass still littering the floor. It was as if the nightmare had been a cruel trick of my mind, a waking dream I'd been pulled into. But my bruised wrist and the lingering sense of dread told a different story. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the pounding of my heart. My hands were still shaking as I reached for the phone, desperate to call my parents, to tell them everything that had happened. But the phone was dead, no matter how many times I pressed the buttons or tried to dial. It was as if the nightmare had reached out and severed my connection to the outside world. The silence of the house was oppressive, suffocating. I tried to focus on the mundane, the normal things, like the ticking clock and the familiar comfort of my comic book. But every tick seemed to echo through the room, every shadow seemed to shift and writhe. The light from the lamp seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper. I ventured into the kitchen, hoping that moving around would shake off the feeling of dread. The refrigerator hummed softly, a comforting sound in the midst of the eerie quiet. I reached for a glass of water, my hands still trembling. As I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the kitchen floor, was a smear of something dark, red, almost black. It trailed from the doorway to the living room, and I knew it was blood. My heart skipped a beat as I followed the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The blood led back to the living room, to the spot where the shattered window still stood, a gaping hole in the wall. I followed the blood trail with a growing sense of dread. It led me to the couch, where I saw a small, torn piece of fabric, a fragment of Midnight's collar. My stomach churned with nausea as I picked it up, my mind racing. What had happened to Midnight? What had that creature done to him? The light from the street outside flickered through the broken window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stood frozen, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement, any sign that the nightmare wasn't over. The whispers I had heard earlier seemed to echo through the house, faint but unmistakable. They were like a memory from a bad dream, lingering just at the edge of my perception. Then, I heard it, a soft, scraping sound coming from the hallway. My heart leaped into my throat, and I turned slowly, my eyes wide with fear. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, the weak light from the flickering bulb doing little to dispel the shadows. The scraping grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was coming closer. My breathing quickened, and I backed away, my eyes darting around for something, anything, that I could use to defend myself. I grabbed a heavy lamp from the side table, its metal cold and solid in my hand. The scraping sound was right outside the living room now, and I could see the shadows moving, shifting, as if something was inching closer. I held my breath, straining to listen, to see what was coming. And then, there it was. A figure appeared in the hallway, emerging from the darkness. It was tall and thin, its movements jerky and unnatural. The creature's face was obscured by shadows, but I could see the hollow, empty eyes staring back at me. The same eyes I had seen before, the same twisted grin. My grip tightened on the lamp, my knuckles white. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. The creature stepped into the living room, its presence filling the space with an oppressive, suffocating darkness. It didn't move toward me. Instead, it stood there, as if waiting, watching. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. The whispers grew louder, more coherent. They were words now, though I couldn't make out what they were saying. They seemed to be coming from the creature, wrapping around me like a dark, cloying mist. I took a shaky step back, trying to keep my composure. The creature's grin widened, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. It was as if it was feeding off my fear, drawing strength from it. I knew I had to do something, anything, to break free from this terror. In a sudden burst of adrenaline, I hurled the lamp at the creature. It shattered against the wall, the light flickering out. The creature recoiled, its form momentarily obscured by the darkness. I seized the opportunity and dashed toward the broken window, hoping to find an escape. I scrambled through the shards of glass, ignoring the pain as they cut into my skin. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but it was refreshing, a stark contrast to the suffocating terror inside the house. I ran into the yard, my breath coming in gasps, and looked back at the house. The creature stood by the broken window, its eyes glowing eerily in the dark. It didn't follow me outside, but I could feel its gaze piercing through the night, watching me from the shadows. I didn't know where I was going or how I would get through the night, but I knew one thing: I had to get away from that house. I had to find somewhere safe, somewhere the darkness couldn't reach me. The terror wasn't over, not yet, but I had survived another night, and for now, that was enough. As I stumbled into the darkness of the yard, I promised myself that I would never let my guard down again. The creature might have stayed behind, but the shadows of that night would follow me forever. And I would be ready.